Good morning, everyone. So we left off last week with um, a description of a line that dates back to the Baal Shem Tov himself, to the dawn of Chassidus, in which he speaks about the letters somehow glowing. Um, what we'll try to do in this year really is focus a little bit on Tefillah and the Chassidish or the Baal Shem Tov's model of tefillah and understand that specifically, and then tie that in with a range of Hasidic ideas, all of which have this sort of common denominator of seeing the world as suffused with this divine energy in a manner which isn't identical to the non-Hasidic way of looking at things, whilst philosophically perhaps derived from the work of earlier Kabbalists, is somehow made more personal and more psychological and more holistic with the work of the Baal Shem Tov and the Hasidim that follow. But for now, we're just going to focus on Tefillah. And I mentioned this mystical state that the Baal Shem Tov wants to induce in every davener, in the process of tefillah. We often refer to tefillah as a meditative experience, and yet it isn't really if you daven in the classic kavana way, because you're very conscious of yourself. You're standing and talking to God. That's a conversation. So it's a very powerful thing, but that's a conversation. I'm turning to God and saying, give me use of my mind so that I can do well at my work, I can pass my exams. I want to have health. Baruch Aleinu, I want to have livelihood. So when we talk about tefillah as being meditative or the like, it's not really in such a simple way. There is a meditative aspect to it in picturing oneself as standing in God's presence, Omed Lifnei Hamakom. But the Baal Shem Tov really created a certain type of meditative experience, which can induce a near mystical experience, in which a mystical meaning, people ask me what I mean. I said last week, I think that in the same way as I claim that everyone is a philosopher, everyone is a mystic, I mean that we are capable of, at least on occasion, losing sense of our self-awareness, and on some level, negating our sense of self or experiencing a union with the divine, such a strong sense of the immanence and presence of God that we almost forget ourselves. We discussed last week this sort of altered state of consciousness that this reflects. And for the purposes of our discussion, the Baal Shem Tov, citing a pasuk, perhaps seeing it as genuinely a meaning in the pasuk, or at least punning on it, takes a pasuk in the muddle of all places in Parshas Noach, Tzoya Tasel Teva, and rather than seeing that as a window or a light, Tzoya means a gleaming, glowing light, shall you make for the ark? He translates as Tzoya Tasel Teva. You should make the Teva, the letter, glow. And there's this meditative experience in which the letters glow when you daven. And for someone who engages in this form of contemplative tefillah, and really, I may be wrong here, but to the best of my knowledge, the only Chassidus that at least publicly speaks about this sort of tefillah, and in which some practitioners still engage in this, is Chabad. And even within Chabad, under the leadership of the seventh leader of Chabad, Rabbi Mendel Schneerson, that practice declined and went down to near extinction. There are very few Chassidim left who still engage in contemplative tefillah. In fact, I'll just turn off the recording and mention one of them, because I'm going to speak about someone who's still alive and personal and have a personal family connection there. But that's one example of as I said, a handful of people that still remain practicing this. Now, the words of just explain what this means. Whilst we may think that davening is an awareness of the translation of the words, Rafa'inu Hashem b'nei Rafa, you turn to Hashem and say, Hashem, please heal me. The Baal Shem Tov asks us to engage in a contemplation of the letters, as I said, so that the letters glow, so that we are aware of immersive in the shape, in the texture, in the feel, in the movements of our lips, in the articulation, that the physical and sensory and spiritual and contemplative, above all, experience of the glowing of the letters themselves, and rather than thinking about even the meaning of the word. And this seems very counterintuitive. This seems almost contrary to the essence of tefillah. I mean, what on earth would this mean if Chazal wrote, "Rafa'inu Hashem b'nei Rafa," Hashem, let's be healed? What would it mean to remove oneself, in a sense, from the meaning of the word and just contemplate and engage in the letters? But first of all, let's just hear the words of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov writes, he says, in tefillah, one must invest one's power in the utterance. and move in this way, he says, from letter to letter. So we're sort of letter by letter experiencing the word until one becomes oblivious to corporeality, to physicality. And remember this getting us back to a form of bittul hayesh, that Hasidic term of nullification of the yesh, of the sense of existence, of self-existence. Bittul hayesh, I cease to be. And he says, until one becomes oblivious or unaware of one's own corporeality, of one's own physical existence, and think of the letter combinations and letters combining and permeating with each other, the sort of merging of the letters into words. And he says this is a great delight. There's a pleasure in this. In that sense, in many meditative experiences, there's a pleasure. And if one can, I just, again, to remind you, altered states of consciousness sounds very posh and fancy and sort of removed from our life experiences, but we all experience this altered states of consciousness. The most apparent and obvious one that all of us go through is sleep. We're still conscious in sleep. That means we have some degree of awareness. We have dreams. We perhaps do hear sounds from outside. That's why we can be woken up. That's why sounds from outside can integrate into our dream. I mentioned, if the alarm goes off, we might dream about a fire alarm or a school bell going, whatever it is. So we are somewhat aware when we're asleep. It's an altered state of consciousness. And the other experiences which are so immersive and perhaps so continual that we to some degree become less aware of other bodily sensations and experiences. I mentioned driving as a classic one. You might be in the flow of driving and along the motorway, and it's just minute after minute, maybe an hour after hour of the same sorts of experiences. And maybe you only emerge from that altered state of consciousness when the car in front of you suddenly brakes or the like. Now, again, there's a lot of discussion about whether this is a safe or an unsafe way of driving, but it is something that I suppose to some degree many might have experienced over here if you are, for better or for worse, relaxed drivers. I mentioned public speakers sometimes have a type of altered state of consciousness, or it may even be as simple as you're reading a very good book and you cease to notice anything else going on. Maybe while you're reading the book propped up on the table, you're also eating supper and you don't even remember what you ate for supper. So that means that our consciousness is so focused on something else that we become unaware or oblivious to other things going on around ourselves. We suspend disbelief when we're watching a film, and we're sort of, you may be watching a film and you know that this is just images on a screen. You know this film was filmed 20 years ago, the actors aren't harmed in the film, and that you may tense up as you see an actor going through a situation of danger and the like. So whilst these are as sort of in a systematic way or unfamiliar terms, on a sort of folk level, we've all met them to some degree or other. And there is, Baal Shem Tov says there's a great delight in this, and there is a great delight in this, meaning if you go through some of these experiences, you can feel very relaxed and emerge from them feeling quite good about yourself. And then he says afterwards, so this is again the Baal Shem Tov still speaking, so he says you focus on the letters, on letter one by one, until Tefilla is this sort of meditative experience in which you lose awareness of self through focusing solely on the letters. And afterwards, one arrives at, he says, we can translate this as he says the middle, the quality, the state of being, the dimension of ayin, of nothingness. Remember again that even though we think we live in a world of yesh me'ayin, of something from nothing, in truth, according to Chassidic philosophy, we live in a world of ayin me'yesh, of nothing from something. The only reality that exists, the only yeshut that exists is God. And we human beings, or physical existence is really all an illusion. Controversial idea, but we'll go with it for now, in which we are really ayin, and therefore the greatest truth we can reach is an awareness of our ayinness, of our non-existence. Again, ideas that sound in a way very beautiful and spiritual, also very troubling and philosophically problematic. We've discussed all that. We're now immersing ourselves in the thinking of the Baal Shem Tov from his own perspective. We're temporarily simply trying to comprehend and experience what the Baal Shem Tov wants us to experience. So he says that you go through this contemplative experience till you become oblivious to your corporeality, but you're still aware of yourself. You move on from self-awareness to non-awareness of self, which sounds paradoxical, but many mystics claim this is a possible state. And you achieve the middle of ayin, of nothingness, which has a truth to it, a greater truth than the illusory life we live, the illusion we live, in which we think that there is reality to our physical existence. Meaning, says the Baal Shem Tov, that there's a complete annulment of all physical powers. And he says we are now in the world of Atzilus, in the world of emanation. Atzilus is a Kabbalistic term for the first stage of emanation of existence or non-existence from God. So this is the direct quote of the Baal Shem Tov. And I want to try and unpick that so that we can understand what this means. Now, tefillah is a very problematic pursuit. It's philosophically and psychologically a very difficult thing to do. And it's not for nothing that I think to some degree or other, many of us struggle. I can only speak for myself, but I'm sure many others also struggle with tefillah. It's very interesting because it's one of the most, from a sort of ritual Jewish lived point of view, it's one of the most frequent experiences that we are called upon to engage in, and yet it's one of the hardest things really to relate to. A good Litvak would say Talmud Torah is much easier. Talmud Torah, I mean, what's nice in Talmud Torah, you engage in using your mind to think and to understand ideas. That's a beautiful thing. Sometimes someone will say, I don't enjoy learning. No such thing. Everyone enjoys learning. People may not have found the right genre of learning that they enjoy. Not everyone is going to love halacha. Not everyone's going to love Gemara. Not everyone's going to love philosophy. Not everyone's going to love Musa or Nach. But out of the whole genre of learning experiences available, everyone should enjoy Talmud Torah. It's simply using our mind to comprehend ideas. Tefillah is very difficult. Chesed is again a very accessible form of spirituality. Tefillah is very difficult. Tefillah is difficult philosophically, and I don't want to spend too long talking about tefillah. I think probably on other occasions we've dedicated specific, either in this setting or elsewhere, shiurim to discussions of tefillah. But of course, at its heart, there are a number of problems with tefillah. First of all, what does it mean for me to speak to God? In what sense can I, a mere mortal, speak to God? Is tefillah looking to change God's mind? In what way can God's mind be changed? How does it make sense for God to change his mind? How should my requests influence him? In what way should they influence him? If he anyway does things for the best, then how can I alter what's meant to happen for the best by my tefillah and the like? These are very profound and serious problems. Now, there are answers given to these questions. And again, I want to skim through them because my focus isn't. I just want to get really to the Baal Shem Tov's answer to the question. But there are answers given to the question, some of which make sense logically, but also seem to lose, in a sense, the heart of what tefillah is about. So, one of the answers given, for example, you may have heard this many times, is that tefillah is a reflexive experience. The word hitpalel is arguably grammatically a reflexive verb, in which it's referring to something done to oneself, hitpalel, and it means self-judgment. So tefillah really isn't about a simple request to God. Tefillah is about a self-reflection and a self-judgment, in which Pelel, one of the translations of the word Pelel is to judge. In today modern Hebrew, you have Avera Pelili, a criminal act. In the Tefillas of Yom Neroim, we talk about Plilut, sort of judgments and so on. So Lit Pelel means to self-judge. And it's to explore one's motives, one's wishes, one's recognition that everything one is and has comes from God, that everything one is and has ought to be used for the service of God. And really, when I'm standing in front of God and I'm saying, what I'm really saying is that these are all roots of recognizing that God is the source of all existence, and upon him I am absolutely dependent. There are tefillahs that are clearly saying that. I mean, is stating that you graciously give to humans minds. Many of the brachas and tefillahs that are praise to God are openly and blatantly stating that. They're saying, God, you are the source of all existence. You give us everything we have. And there's no doubt that's the meaning of those tefillahs. But there are other tefillahs that look like they are requests. We say, now we ask us to graciously give us that. Or, please graciously give us healing. So why are we now requesting from God if all the essence of tefillah is recognizing that everything comes from God? In a sense, the answer to the question is it's another means of saying the same idea or expressing the same concept, which is in requesting, I'm also recognizing that this all comes from God. And in so doing, I'm changing myself and molding myself. And if I then ask, does tefillah affect in any way what I receive from God? The answer is yes, absolutely yes. Because in changing myself, in molding myself, to better recognize that everything comes from God and better commit to using everything in God's service, I might make myself a better receptacle to receive God's graciousness and God's kindness. We can say this mathematically, or we can say this in a more contemplative manner. We can say this mathematically. Imagine an individual, Reuven. And Reuven in no way deserves good health or livelihood or intellectual acumen or the like. Why? Because were Reuven to receive any of these, this would be the worst thing in the world for him and would make God's presence in the world yet less manifest. Because as Reuven receives livelihood or intelligence or health. He simply becomes less God-aware, more smug, more arrogant, more malicious, more selfish, and therefore the worst thing in the world is for Reuven to receive any of these gifts. And the worst thing for the world is for Reuven to receive any of these. The greater Reuven's physical success becomes, the greater his ego, the greater he blocks the presence of the divine in the world, and therefore Reuven is sealed for lack of prosperity and health and the like. Reuven now turns and engages in genuine tefillah, hits palel, he judges himself, he reflects and becomes somewhat more aware that actually he's helpless by himself and he needs God's gifts in order to survive, and perhaps even better, he will use some of God's gifts for good purposes. He thus now deserves to receive some flow of divine energy, and this is how tefillah is effective. Something like that is one model or one answer often given to how tefillah works. And I'm going to say the same idea in a sort of different language. I'm going to say, and I think both are true, we can say that God is constantly radiating energy, and we have to, like the sun is pouring out energy, far more energy than the world needs. We have, we talk about energy crisis. There's far more energy than humanity could possibly need outflowing from the sun. We just have to build solar panels to receive it. So a second way of thinking about this is that tefillah aligns us to become better solar panels, as it were, to receive better kalim, to receive God's graciousness. So this is some of the discourse that you'll often see around here around tefillah. And this is true. There's no doubt this is all correct. The problem with this is that taken superficially, it's missing a crucial element, and it makes our relationship to God and our tefillah somewhat mechanical. If we engage appropriately in tefillah, almost algorithmically, God will now give us more, and it doesn't. It loses an element of what our relationship to God is about, and also in some ways it makes it harder to daven in the classic sense of the word, in which we're meant to talk. I'm speaking to God, aware of the divine presence, standing in front of God, which surely is what tefillah is. Tefillah isn't just some sort of enhanced self-improvement regime. Surely tefillah is in some level genuinely standing in front of God, which I am doing lihit palel. That's why it's saying it's this self-judgment of positioning myself and standing in front of God to pray, to become more aware that everything comes from Him and that everything needs to be used to Him. But is it merely a sort of psychological exercise? It feels like there's something lacking in this model. And is everyone with me in this? So the element that is often missed in this formulation, which we need to re-emphasize, is that behind this lies ultimately God's freely chosen will to give and to grant us. It's not that God is somehow mechanically now, forced to give because I've aligned myself with God, but behind that is still that core awareness that I'm standing basking in the divine love and the divine graciousness of ultimately the free-willed choice of a altruistic being, God, to give me and to overflow. And ultimately, in tefillah, I am attaching myself at its best to something very deep and profound, to the very initial will of God, in Ratzon, will, or in Kabbalistic terminology, and I'll explain in a minute around this, is referred to as the sphere of Keter, the crown of God, which precedes all other existence. Let me just try and explain this a little more. When we push ourselves, and we've done this in the Rambam and in his Moed Nevuchim and others, we ask ourselves, why did God create the world? We say because why couldn't God just give us goodness? And we say because we have to earn the goodness, and a whole array of philosophical ideas. But at its core, the deepest we can say about anything is because this is what God willed. In other words, pre-talking about the will of God, we have nothing to say whatsoever. We ultimately don't understand God. The Rambam teaches us in his Guide to the Perplexed, we have no vocabulary to talk about God. Any tools we can talk about God are post-human reason and post-language and our ability to even talk logically. And the furthest back we can go in understanding anything, in a sense, is in the language of the Rambam, he says, Kach ola b'ritzonu, thus emerged in his will. Because if we ask ourselves, and why did God want what he wanted? So we'll come up with some explanation. And why did God want what he wanted to want? We'll come up with another explanation. But ultimately, we hit a paradox beyond which we can't go, in which God is a free-willed agent. And therefore the most we can say is, thus he willed, this is what he chose. So that the highest level in philosophical and Kabbalistic thought of what we can say about God ultimately comes down to Rotzen, to thus he willed. If we like, the first emanation from God, the first possibility of any awareness outside God himself, the first possibility of existence is Rotzen. Let me try and put this differently. Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created. Is there anything that preceded Bereshit? So in some sense, no, because there's a paradox even in the word preceded, because with Bereshit is the creation of time itself. So the Kabbalists say we live in an Olam Habriya. We live in a created world. There are things that follow creation. After the beginning of existence itself coming into being, there is Yetzira. There is carving and molding. That's one of the words used in Parshat Bereshit. Vayitzer Hashem Elokim, God Baruch Hu molded or created, for example, human beings. So we now have matter, and matter is formed and molded into a form. Yetzira means from the word sur, to carve or to sculpture. Surah is a form reminiscent of some of Platonic forms that we've discussed, Choma and Surah. And then there's Asiyah, for example, God does. So there's a causal chain from existence itself coming into creation to the real world we know. Is there anything we can talk about that precedes creation? The answer is temporally and time not, because time itself comes into existence. But conceptually, yes. Something precedes Bria itself, creation itself, is the will to create. Now, the will to create pushes us to the very edge of human vocabulary, because we can't say anything further than thus God willed. And in a sense, that world of will is the very first emanation we can talk about as coming from God. This is what the Kabbalists refer to as Atzilut. It's very hard for human vocabulary to say anything about it. It's Atzilut, the etymology of the word Atzilut is from the word etzel, next to. Have people vaguely heard any of these Kabbalistic terms floating around at all? Okay, so Tefilla, in a sense, is calling upon ourselves to focus on the fact that we humans live as a gracious gift of God. I'll explain what I mean by the word gracious in a minute, because it's an old-fashioned word. As by the grace of God, and in a sense, maybe that's the deepest we can go. What do I mean by graciousness? I mean wholly unearned. Even though we speak about earning our right to existence, earning our existence as the purpose of free will, behind that lies a gift which by definition is unearned and completely unearned and can't be earned, which is the very will to will us into existence, to bring us into existence. The Hebrew word for graciousness is chein. You'll often hear Avram motza chein. Avram found favor in the eyes of God. What favor means that it is a favor, it's not earned. Chein is linked etymologically to the word chinam, free. By definition, chein is unearned. It has to be unearned. It's graciousness or favor. If I say do me a favor, what I really mean is it's unearned. I don't have a right to demand it of you. Ultimately, we have no right to make any demands of God. Everything he grants us is chinam, is free, is an act of chein. The pasuk says that in a sense, the most we can say, the deepest we can get, so I'm quoting a pasuk here, is I grant favor to those I choose to grant favor to, and I grant mercy to those I choose to grant mercy to. I'll come to the moment. We can't go further than that. Ultimately, we get to a world of everything is unearned. Everything is simply an act of undeserved kindness emanating from God. And this is a deeper way of thinking about tefillah. And this gets us back, in a sense, to the old-fashioned, pre-philosophical vision of what tefillah is. We ask questions in tefillah. We can say, what's it mean that I'm standing in front of the presence of God? How can I ask for something? How can I change God's mind? These are all good questions. Let's push them all to the side, though, and just get to the core of tefillah. The essence of prayer is, I'm standing in front of God, awareness of all I can do is cup my hands. One of the ways maybe of cupping my hands is this parallel self-judgment, maybe not. But all I can do is recognize I am a humble receptacle for God's graciousness, and I'm standing in the presence of God, in which presence God's ultimately in the highest, closest way a human being can get to the presence of God, which is an awareness of our inner emptiness and our inner void, simply able to receive the gift of existence itself, and that is wholly undeserved. Now, we are getting here close. We'll understand a little better soon. We're getting here close to the sort of sense of consciousness that the Baal Shem Tov is calling upon us to adopt. Because it's very nice saying, I am a utensil to receive God's blessing. The utensil is a void. There's an emptiness there. I'm just a shell. And all I can do is receive God's gift existence and gift of existence. But even the vessel that is to receive that gift of existence comes from God itself. So there are sort of layers upon layers of contemplation, in which on one level I can say I am simply this kli kibbul, this vessel to receive God's existence. On a deeper level, even the vessel comes from God. We come to say this in the beginning of davening. We say, I'm going to speak to you, God, but even my ability to speak has within it God's power. Hashem, open my mouth, my lips, and let my mouth say your praise. So even my ability to to have a vessel to receive your blessing, it comes from God itself. I need a vessel for the vessel. Even that I need to empty of content. And the essence of tefillah is, in this vision, the highest a human can achieve. A human aligning themselves most fully with Ratzon Hashem, with an awareness of the divine presence. Now, I know the people that want to ask questions. I just want to finish the chain and then we'll pause. Now, says the Baal Shem Tov, if in prayer I am aware of my needs, I'm even aware of the meaning of the words, even that means that there's a yeshut, there's something to me. I'm not a complete vessel. Even if I'm in my words saying I'm a vessel, but I still have ownership of the words. The deepest I can get to is where I am in a state of consciousness where the words carry me, where the words create me. This is the metaphor of the light, the glowing the glowing radiance that the Baal Shem Tov is hearing us to see in the words. Even the words aren't my own. Even the words are lifting me and carrying me and are suffusing me with energy. My ability to say the words themselves are received from above, are themselves an animation of the divine. And if one can allow oneself to be in that flow, then one ceases and loses self-awareness. And in the language of the Baal Shem Tov, afterwards one arrives at the mid of nothingness, meaning that all his physical powers are annulled, and one's in the world of emanation, of Atzilut. One ends up in the world in which all one is aware of is, I am a manifestation of Ratzon Hashem. But even talking about it philosophically is missing this. This has to be experienced to be understood. Because it's not like a philosophical thing, I am an emanation of God. It's an experience of being an emanation of God. Let me just try and help us understand this a bit psychologically. We mentioned the idea of being in the flow, where I'm always cease to be aware of myself. Even something trivial like driving, I'm sort of just, there's almost like a merging of mind and machine, or horse riders experience these things. One of the changes that occurred in Tefillah is that the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah rid us of the major part of Tefillah, of me expressing my own words, and shifted that to me reciting words coined by them. One of the consequences of that is that it becomes hard to have kavanah, because it's hard to have intention in saying someone else's words. But turning that on its head, one of the consequences of that is that when I'm davening, I can be in this flow where I'm not thinking of crafting my own words. I'm not even thinking about my own needs in a sense. I'm being carried upon by their words. You know, if you're a regular davener and you're not stumbling over the words or even needing to follow the text, let's say, you're just saying them, there can become a loss of a sense of self and almost an obliviousness even to the words themselves. And my whole contemplation is that the words themselves are giving me energy. I become nothing more than a vehicle for the words, and my very existence is built upon the words themselves that lift and carry me. And this, says the Baal Shem Tov, is a profound state in which even words cease to carry their own meaning within them, and I am wholly a vessel for the divine. I'm wholly negated myself, even the utensil, even the walls of the utensil, even the words themselves, the art. And this is why he isn't merely punning the pasuk. He's building and saying, even the vehicle upon which I travel, my body, myself, my sense of consciousness is divinely suffused with energy. And therefore, I'm not just, as perhaps pre-Baal Shem Tov, I might think of it as making myself a utensil to receive godliness, but even the utensil is suffused and powered by godliness. This is the contemplative experience that the Baal Shem Tov is calling upon us to have. I'll pause because this has been a flow of ideas, and I know there's a number of questions. Is anyone with me in this? Am I on some level other managers convey something? Yeah. Yes.
By place unearned, where do mitzvahs? What's the point of mitzvahs?
Mitzvahs are aligning ourselves to better be vehicles of of receiving that which God has to give, but ultimately we are nothing. Ultimately, the peak of all human wisdom is to realize we are. In the sense, this is not far from Maimonides. Maimonides is to realize that we are everything we receive is graciousness from God. The Baal Shem Tov is saying even the we that receives the graciousness is of the graciousness of God. This isn't just there's a me here, a consciousness that is dependent upon God. It's the consciousness itself is of God. And that's where he gets to his bittul hayesh, to his negation of self. Now, again, I want to emphasize this. This sounds like a very beautiful idea and going a step further than even Rambam goes. It's not just there's a me here that receives everything from God, but the me itself is of God and therefore negated. It sounds like a profound spiritual idea, and it is a profound spiritual idea because the great Baal Shem Tov said it. But the opponents of the Baal Shem Tov don't understand what this means, and this is what we discussed last week. They say this is becoming Buddhism. This is becoming this is breaking the boundaries of between the divine and God. They asked your very question: in this world, what is the place of mitzvahs and halacha? If everything is suffused with godly energy, what is good and what is bad, and what is bad and what is good? This is pantheism. This is seeing God as in all existence and so on. So one can oppose these ideas. We're not going down that path. We're simply trying to put ourselves into the mindset the Baal Shem Tov is calling upon us to adopt. Yes.
Use the extension to say that actually, do the actual words you say become less relevant? So the actual words of Tefilla that you're saying are not as important as experiencing the state of in which you're saying it.
So the words have importance because they are godly words, and God communicates through words. That's the closest we can have to articulating Ratzon. But my experience of the words, in a sense, goes deeper than the meaning of the words. So the Baal Shem Tov would say as follows: you have a perfect alignment between words that mean something, but in truth, the words that mean something are formed by letters or syllables that build them, and behind those letters and syllables, we get to the closest to sort of the raw Ratzon Hashem, which precedes words and in a sense predates words and is above words itself. Our ability to use words is because we have logic and reason, but in a sense we want to get beyond logic and reason to the world of pure divine will, in which even human reason breaks down. There have to be words. If you're just saying nonsense, if you're just talking in tongues and saying sounds, the problem isn't that these words don't have meanings. The problem, and you can induce mystical states like that, and there are other faiths that have such mystical experiences. The problem is that it isn't holistic because we humans do exist in a world of reason. We do have a body, we do have a mind, but therefore there needs to be an alignment of taking that mind, that body, that meaning, and moving it upwards into seeing that these are actually channels for divine flow of energy.
The person does not engage his mind, his intellect, to understand what he's saying.
Yes.
That's not relevant.
You are aware that these words have meaning, and they do have meaning, but what you're saying is right in a sense. The opponents of the Baal Shem Tov would say you've negated in this form of contemplative Tefilla, the whole of Tefilla. I mean, these words were coined to say something. The Baal Shem Tov agrees that that's Shlav Aleph, that's the foundation, that's the basics, and that's how you start off davening. But he's saying you can go further than that, in which you sort of immerse yourself in the word, and ultimately you immerse yourself in the letter, and maybe even beyond the letter, in the shape of the letter, the syllables of the letter, and the like. I should mention that these are not contemplative practices which are entirely new to the Baal Shem Tov. I can't remember if we've ever gone through it in detail or not. Chassidei Ashkenaz, did we ever do the early Chassidic movements in the times of the Baalei Tosfos, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, Sefer Rekeach, Kabbalistic movements? We've done that before. So we've mentioned it definitely when we did the Baalei Tosfos. I don't know if we did a series on it or not. There were other mystical movements that arose, for example, in the 1200s in Ashkenaz, not linked to what we call the Chassidim movement, with a gap of geography and 300 years of time. There's a newly discovered manuscript, for example, in I think found in Oxford, in which we find very, very similar. It's just been published in the last 9 months or so, a book-length manuscript that was found, which we found very, very similar meditative experiences from the Chassidei Ashkenaz, absolutely remarkable, in which there's a focus on syllables of words and so on. They don't take it as far as the Baal Shem Tov does in sort of it being a contemplative experience, but they focus on literally the syllables that make up sounds and have meditative exercises connected with it. Very, very interesting. And someone just gifted me or lent me a copy, which I'm working my way through. Very, very interesting. So, This does tie in a little bit to the story of the shepherd boy who just comes to the back of the shul and sings the Aleph bass, and the Hasidic story of there's something more powerful about his prayer than our prayer. It is linked to that idea, but for now, again, there's plenty of room for opponents of Hasidus to say we don't understand what this is all about, but we're trying to understand the Baal Shem Tov calling upon us to immerse oneself. And again, he literally says this. He says, invest your power in the utterances, in the move from letter to letter, until you become oblivious to your physical existence, to corporeality. Think of the letters combining and permeating with each other. Move on from that to the dimension, to the middle of nothingness, and meaning that all physical powers are annulled, and one's now in the world of emanation, Atzilut, which means the world of just negation to divine Rotzen, to divine will. Yeah.
I mean, our relationship with Hashem from the time of the Ovis onwards
Yes.
was covenantal.
Yes.
Everything going to Har Sinai,
Yes.
covenantal. So how does that fit in with the Baal Shem Tov?
It's
Therefore, all the mitzvahs and everything,
Yeah.
we know what they're meant to give us the satellite dish to receive better.
It's very difficult, your question. There speaks a good litvak. You're right, and this is a problem. The opponents of the Baal Shem Tov, of this movement, say that in annulling yourself, let me unpick your question just to explain it more fully. The Baal Shem Tov is ostensibly giving a deeper form of spirituality than the non-Hasidic movement, because he's saying, negate yourself completely, cease to exist. As we discussed in previous weeks, the problem with ceasing to exist is then what's the purpose of creation? If I completely cease to exist, then what am I? In what way? Why did God give me? Let's ask the question. Why am I? Why do I exist? So there's many answers to give to this question, and many layers to unpick it. But on a very superficial level, what the classic Jewish way of thinking about this is God says graciously, we accept that, so freely given gift and no way earned, has chosen to give me the gift of existence, so that there should be a me. That's what makes it an act of chesed, of kindness. We say God is altruistic, he's kind. One of the few things we know about God is he willed us into existence. He wants us to be. He's given us the greatest gift of all, the gift of existence. Why is this life so difficult, and why do we go through the pain of existence? Well, the purpose is because ultimately we believe we can sublimate the challenges of existence and thus earn to some degree our own existence, because it's only earned existence that has something real to it. We express that idea. One of the ways we express this is through mitzvahs. We can really make a difference to the world. There's things we need to achieve. Taking on people call it, we live in an imperfect world and we have to perfect it. Another way of expressing it is as Peter just said, is a bris, a covenant. The point of a covenantal relationship is the etymology of the word covenant is coming together, in which both parties recognize they can't achieve alone that which they can achieve together. What? I can enter a covenantal relationship with the infinite, the finite can enter a covenantal relationship with the infinite? The answer is yes. We're not saying it's a relationship of equals, but yes, there is something I can contribute, because if there's nothing I can contribute, then what's the purpose of my existence? What am I? Can I contribute anything to the divine? Ultimately, no. But God has chosen to share his existence with us. He's chosen to give us space to make a difference, and within that space, we can genuinely make a difference. If we would adopt, again, I know very little about these things, I don't talk about other faiths, but if we would adopt some Eastern faiths from the outside seem to be saying this, the purpose of all existence and the pain of all existence is to achieve nullification of my existence, non-existence. And the only peace that a human can achieve is to cease to exist in this world of pain, and we may need to go through several cycles of existence until we can achieve that. The Jewish question that is, then this is pointless. If all of existence is the ultimate peak of existence and non-existence, then what have we achieved? What has been the purpose of our existence? And paradoxically, it ends up meaning that our existence is a contradiction to divinity. The only thing that allows existence not to contradict the divine, how can it be that me, with my ego and with my lust and with all my arrogance and my selfishness and all my character failings that block the existence of God, how can that align with the unity and all pervasive perfection of God? And the only answer we can give to that is because these very problems are the source of my ability to bring godliness into the world. But if the most I can achieve is by self-negation, then what was ever the point of this stage of my existence? My psyche exists and isn't, even the Baal Shem Tov will agree, isn't naturally aware of godliness in the world. And that's a terrible thing. That's a chilul Hashem. That's a void of God's presence if I'm not aware of God's presence. The only answer we can give to that is, but that very lack of awareness is what I can use to bring God's awareness into the world. But if the ultimate peak is non-existence, then what was ever the point of it? So in this theology, it has the potential that existence is illusion. It has the potential to make us question then the purpose of existence, our ability to navigate existence, to declare this is evil and this is good, to undermine halacha, and ultimately calls into question what is the role of the covenant, is there a genuine relationship? Surely a relationship with God demands that there's a me and a him, that there are two of us in this relationship. If love destroys, then it ceases to be love. All love has to be built with unfortunately, some marriages turn this way. A relationship can become one in which the love becomes claustrophobic and ultimately suffocating and ultimately a destruction of the other person. At that point, one ceases to be married. There aren't a two with the tension in the relationship, which is what makes it into a partnership between two. If God's love overwhelms us to such a degree that we cease to exist, then what is the love and what is the gift of existence and where is their partnership? Where is the covenant? Now, we don't know entirely how to answer that question other than it must be that on some level, even the Baal Shem Tov is agreeing that this is a journey, perhaps an infinite journey, but there's never cessation of self. The opponents of Chassidus question this, though. They saw that as lacking in his theology, as lacking in his thought, and we don't know where to go with it. There's a story in which the greatest of the Chassidic rabbis, possibly they tell us about Rabbi Zobin of Liati, the third generation students of the Maggid, so students of the Baal Shem Tov, as he's lying in his deathbed, reaches this peak of spiritual perfection in which he ceases to see the roof. Now, probably roof is a metaphor because roof is a barrier, like a sukkah, a barrier between us and the heavens. And he says the roof no longer exists. We don't know 100% if this is a true story or not, but from a non-Chassidic point of view, we don't know what to make of that. If the peak of existence is that the world is an illusion, then what is existence? And where the Torah says not like that. The Torah says there is creation. The Torah says there is the Torah says there is mayim, there is water, and all halach is predicated on existence. The translation of the first chapter of Bereshit is predicated on that. So it sounds very beautiful, this model that we are meant to see ayin miyesh, not yesh me'ayin. We're meant to see as existence, as nothingness. So again, all of this we went through in previous weeks. In a sense, I don't have the ability to explain this theology to the nth degree. I don't know where one goes entirely with this, but there are elements of this that we can dip into, and I hope we do. The reason I'm learning this is because to see a world suffused with divine energy surely is a good thing. To be able to engage in Tefilla, in which we are awareness of the degree to which even our satellite dish, even our receiver dish in your language is from God, that is a good thing. That's there, and the Baal Shem Tov calls upon us to deepen our awareness of this. How far this idea goes remains a subject of debate with Litvak's critiquing Chassidus for taking it too far. Sorry, Neil, want to ask something, and I'll come to you.
Yeah, so regards to this continue the idea that Baal Shem Tov saying this is a journey.
Yes.
For most of the time.
Yes.
Existence, and even those most spiritual still have to need something else, work,
Yes.
still have relationships. So is it like basically a combination that we live in a real world, we do have this skeleton, but we can maybe a Tefilla is one of those moments where we can sort of touch the divine, but it's the vehicle for the aspiration, but most of the time, most people can only aspire but can't do.
So 2 points. I want to take your question sort of psychologically and philosophically. On a psychological level, what you said no doubt is correct. Most of the time, most of us are not going to live in these elevated realms. The most we can do is dip into it. And I'm arguing that that's something that as a Litvak we should also, as non-Chassidim, we should also do. Dipping into moments of mystical experience, of divine union is surely a good thing and no harm in that. Did the Baal Shem Tov recognize that most people most of the time won't do this? We don't know, but probably, that's probably the reality of the world. Though the Baal Shem Tov seems to aspire to a world in which everyone is doing this. We saw his letter, in which everyone is miyachid yichutim, is engaging in these divine unifications and having aliyas neshama and the like. Okay. Now we have a philosophical question. Did the Baal Shem Tov mean this to the nth degree, in which there is a complete negation of self and a complete self-destruction, in which a complete awareness of an illusion of the world? Some of his opponents thought he did, and this again is what led to the alarm, the extreme alarm they felt, and why a seemingly innocuous movement of Jewish spirituality aroused such opposition. Because as we explained, if you take it to the furthest degree, the implication sounds heretical. It unravels the bris in your language, it unravels mitzvahs, it unravels human existence. It seems to morph Judaism. It's pantheistic. It seems to morph Judaism into Buddhism. I don't know. It seems to be if the peak of it is non-existent. So we don't really 100% know how to answer this question. One answer to the question is yes, the Baal Shem Tov meant it all this way and had a very different picture of Judaism. Some of the opponents thought that and were profoundly troubled by it. Another answer to the question is that this is a loss in vocabulary. Because not just on a psychological level, but on a philosophical level, the Baal Shem Tov simply meant this as an eternal journey. Mathematically, if you can have graphs in which there's an asymptote, there's a line that moves ever closer to the graph line and never touches it. It's perfectly mathematically possible. You have an infinite journey in which you can ever grow closer without ever reaching the peak. And it could be that this is something like the metaphor of what the Baal Shem Tov meant, in which there is an ever increasing degree of negation of self, but never a complete destruction of self, because otherwise you end up with these paradoxes we've spoken about. So let's say, for example, you achieve that level in which I see the whole world is illusory, but who's experiencing the illusion? Myself. So there is still a bit of self left. Okay, I reach a level where I realize that even my sense of self is an illusion. And who's experiencing that illusion of sense of self? Myself. So you can have, an illusion, a sense of self, a sense of a sense of a sense of a sense of a self. But you can ever dig deeper and realize there's still a me to be found, albeit a me that is ever more aware of its existence solely in the gracious presence of Hashem. So if that's the answer, then we've resolved the problem of Chassidus. And it turns out that in essence, Chassidus is simply a spiritual exercise going further than previously had gone and psychologizing these ideas, but not ultimately in any way contradicting the thought of the opponents of Chassidus in that sense. The problem is, again, I wish I could say I know every word of all Hasidic thought. You don't really find this in the first two generations of Hasidic thought. You don't find this spelt out. You don't find... They use language like "Chelek Elokah Mimal," we are a portion of godliness. Even we are an Eva, a limb of God, of the Godhead. They talk about the world being Ayin Miyesh, the peak of an Adam is Bittul Hayesh. So they're using language that, if you take literally, is talking about negation of self. Their response may be, don't be silly. Of course, we're using this as borrowed terminology. Of course, you can't completely negate yourself, not just because, as Peter's saying and you're saying it, because it contradicts halacha, because psychologically this is impossible. There are serious questions about, can you negate yourself completely? And it seems the answer is no. There must be a consciousness of a consciousness of consciousness. You have who is it? And sometimes you'll hear in modern day materialistic philosophy, people saying something like consciousness is an emergent product of evolution and it's ultimately an illusion or the like. It's an illusion or the like. And this is a philosophical nonsense, because who is it that's experiencing the illusion? This is rubbish that's been debunked hundreds of years ago in philosophy. It's if you want to claim a complete materialistic worldview, you have a problem, because complete materialism says we're ultimately just the same as the table. We're just things. But who is it that's experiencing the thingness of my thingness? Who is it that's aware of myself? So that's just an illusion. Aspects of consciousness may be illusion. The sense of continued identity, you could, at a stretch, argue is an illusion. But the idea that there's zero consciousness seems to be not possible, because who is it that's illusioning the illusion? Who is it that's aware of the illusion of my existence? So it could be that their response to their opponents would be, you've misunderstood our ideas. And all Kabbalah, by definition, uses borrowed language. All theology uses borrowed language. They may say, your complaints against us is because you haven't understood how human language works. Like if someone would say, talk about Zerona Tuya, an outstretched arm, Yad Chazaka, that's heresy, because God doesn't have an arm. We understand it's borrowed language. When the Arizal spoke about Tzimtzum as the contraction of God's presence, of course that's borrowed language in some way. We'll come to Tzimtzum, please God, one day. So maybe they took it as obvious. Don't forget, the Baal Shem Tov didn't write much. This is an oral tradition. And therefore maybe something was lost in translation, something was lost in writing. If that's the case, then there is, from a non-Chassidic point of view, there may be areas we disagree and tweaks, and we'll come to some of those, and different emphasis being put on it. But all Chassidus is, in that sense, is in a sense a classic continuation of Jewish Kabbalistic thought, but putting renewed energy and emphasis and publicization of ideas in ways that hadn't been done previously, psychologizing them, making these lived exercises and the like. But it isn't saying anything that really is theologically dangerous. And then the opposition to Chassidus would be something like, yeah, but look at the damage you're doing by publicizing subtle Kabbalistic ideas and using this coarse language to refer to them, and you're introducing potentially deep misunderstandings, theoretical misunderstandings of Judaism, because you're speaking publicly about things that should have been the preserve of the elite. And then the debate between Chassidim and non-Chassidim would be educative, would be pedagogical, would be questions about how much these ideas are relevant practices to everyone. Or no, maybe most of us simple folk should just focus on classic halachic practice and not get caught up in any of these ideas. So just to summarize, I'll come into other questions in a moment. Taken to the nth degree, Chassidus is presenting a very, very beautiful idea of a divine suffused world, but if taken to its fullest conclusion, one that philosophically is very problematic and seems out of line with Jewish thinking. The opponents of Chassidus, some of the opponents of Chassidus, believed that was the case, thought this was a dangerous or heretical theology. Did the Baal Shem Tov mean that most extreme one? We don't know. If he did, he held that this was legitimate and we'd have to work out how. It's possible, alternatively, that the Baal Shem Tov is laying an extreme emphasis on these ideas, is talking more about negation of self than others did. But the concept of negation of self is not a uniquely Beshtian idea, it's not a uniquely Hasidic idea. The Gemara says, Moshe is more humble than Avraham Avinu. Avraham says, Anochi off of Eifa, I am dust and ashes. David HaMelech says, I'm a worm. Moshe Rabbeinu says, V'nachnu ma, we are what? V'nachnu ma, we are whatness, we are nothingness, we are just complete. We are complete question mark. We are just devoid of vacuum. Moshe is this week's Setra. We just read Balosa. Moshe is Onomon Kanadam. So the idea of emptying yourself of ego and self-negation, and you can understand Bittul Hayesh as a nullification of self as just being a Mussar idea. The problem is it's not quite what the words mean. And if we take words seriously, the words we have from the Baal Shem Tov seem to be saying this to the most extreme. Hence, the understanding of the opponents of Chassidus that these are dangerous ideas. The Hasidic response could be one of two things. Either, yes, we mean it all the way and we dispute you, we think this is legitimate Judaism, or you've taken us too far, we never meant it that far. Chassidus should be viewed as publicizing subtle ideas, building them into the lived experience of Jews, but in no way is it undermining the basic idea, of course, of the reality of our existence and the like. And then the dispute between Hasidic and non-Hasidim would be about publicity, about pedagogy, about how you speak about ideas, but not about about emphasis, how much you emphasize different ideas, but not about a deep theological truth in the deepest level. So you've been waiting very patiently. I know you also wanted to ask something again, yeah?
It's not meant to be mutually exclusive throughout.
Yes.
Way of dying and thinking in terms of Tefilla.
Yes.
Will the Baal Shem Tov take the view that, in a sense, one should like separate from a literal timing point of view consideration of these ideas from one's practice of Tefilla, or is he suggesting that no, actually while you're engaged in the conventional Tefilla, you should be thinking about these ideas? It seems to me that I have great deal of difficulty in digesting these ideas if they're meant to be integrated actually into Tefillah. If, on the other hand, one said, no, Tefillah, fine, stop, have a tea break, and now let's switch over and try and think some of these ideas out.
Okay, so the question is this separate to Tefillah? Is this a discrete moment of Tefillah? I daven in a regular way and then I also do this, or not? The answer to the question is doing this throughout Tefillah, and in truth throughout your life, because you're meant to live a life in which the holiest people live a life in which, as they're wandering through the world, as they're drinking their cup of coffee, they are only experiencing this as a suffusion of divine energy. And again, this is why I'm saying that even us non-Chassidim, there is within this self-work and spiritual practices that we can adopt. It is possible for us as non-Chassidim to, as we drink this coffee, on some level be aware that this is a divine gift that we are experiencing. This is the nectar of the gods. Coffee, caffeine, okay. But we should be able to be aware of that on some level and experience that. And we're meant to be doing that. That's a bracha. And as I'm drinking my coffee, I'm aware that this is a manifestation of the word of God, the Devar Hashem. So again, on some level, the Baal Shem Tov is simply refreshing old ideas with renewed emphasis, but he absolutely means this as Tefillah. This is the heart of Tefillah and the essence of a lived life. Yeah.
Maybe engaging nowadays and giving out time constraints in our schedule,
yes,
etc., which seems to be the least likely opportunity to engage with these ideas and to try and combine them.
So Chassidish Tefillah isn't a rushed Tefillah in this way. It involves a lot of contemplation. It takes hours. The classic image of a Chabad Chassid used to do this was against the wall, engaged in contemplation for perhaps hours upon hours. I'm not talking about how you're meant to fit this into our busy schedules. I am saying that I think aspects of this are things that we could do well to introduce into our own lives without taking theology to the nth degree where it becomes problematic. There's aspects of this that are good spiritual pursuits and exercises to do. Okay, we've run out of time, unfortunately, for today, so we'll stop here. I hope next week then to take really 6 or 7 Chassidish ideas, a cluster of Chassidic ideas, and show how they are all emerging from the same sort of theological mindset, and also speak about the very important argument between Chassidim and Litvaks about what is the highest way to serve God. Is it Tefilla or Torah? Right, famously, this is one of the debates between Chassidim and non-Chassidim, and this, I think by now it should already be relatively clear to everyone how this emerges from this. Which is it? The use of the intellect and intellectual contemplation of the will of God, which is another way of saying halacha, that is the peak of human spirituality, or is it this immersive, contemplative, meditative, mystical state, which is the greatest human negation to God? And that's in a sense the debate between the two, but we'll stop here for today and see how that plays out next week.